country levels to enhance the collaboration between child protection and food security actors, as this event is showing, as this will lead not only to enhanced outcomes in the humanitarian response in food insecure contexts, but also in the prevention of protection risks and harm to children and in contributing to the realization of their rights. At the same time, however, while life-saving interventions remain critical, investing in development is the key to addressing the root causes of the multiple crises that are affecting the well-being of millions of children in the world. This must be done with a sense of emergency and urgency and to scale to get ahead of the crises. Financial resources are more necessary than ever. We need to act together. We need to act urgently and with solidarity. I thank you for listening, and I look forward to the outcomes of this key event. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for your opening remarks and for highlighting especially the current situation in Ethiopia. The numbers you presented are really truly terrifying. And we know that actually beyond this, the stories behind these numbers and statistics and the impact on the lives of children and their families are truly devastating. So we really thank you for joining us and for supporting our call to act together. So now I would like moving into our first segment where we're going to explore a little bit more the linkages between food security and child protection across humanitarian settings. I would like to hand the floor to Yang Fu, a child protection specialist with Plan International. We're in very good hands because Yang is actually currently leading the technical collaboration with the food security sector and will be presenting findings from a recently conducted evidence review. As well as leading this review, Yang has also recently conducted joint workshops with food security and child protection actors in South Sudan and Nigeria, and I believe upcoming in Central African Republic. If you have any questions for Yang, please write these in the chat box as we go along. Over to you, Yang.
Thanks, Elspeth. Thanks so much for this, and good morning and good afternoon, everybody. I do have the pleasure today of sharing the findings of this evidence review, which are part of an initiative being led by the Global Child Protection Area of Responsibility and Plan International to strengthen collaboration and provide practical support to child protection and food security actors. Kira, we can go to the next slide. So thank you, Kira. So why did we want to do an evidence review as part of this initiative? Unmet basic needs, such as food, is universally recognized as a risk factor for harmful outcomes for children. And for many years, we have been hearing from humanitarian actors that food insecurity was exacerbating child protection issues. We can take, for example, the 2016-2017 drought in Kenya, where assessments in two of the hardest hit counties found that pre-existing child protection problems, such as child marriage, child labor, and transactional sex, were more acute and widespread, and in some cases increasing dramatically as a result of food security. On the next slide, at the same time, we were also hearing that humanitarian actors were receiving reports of previously unreported child protection issues, including the sale of children. Most of the research that we have on the linkages between food insecurity and child protection risks does come from developed or high income countries, but we don't have a clear picture of necessarily what was happening in humanitarian contexts. A lot of the information seemed anecdotal or to be only coming from a few responses. So on the next slide, we can see that we set two main objectives for this evidence review. The first and the primary one was to really understand how food insecurity impacts child protection risks in humanitarian settings. And then at the same time, we wanted to better understand how child protection and food security actors were already working together and what results they were achieving. So we looked at academic and grey literature, focused on humanitarian and fragile settings from around the world, and we complemented this with key informant interviews with child protection, and food security actors. So what did we find? Well, we've categorized our findings under four main headings. And the first heading is that food insecurity is linked with poor mental health outcomes and psychosocial distress of children. And caregivers. So a global review of nationally representative food insecurity and mental health data found that food insecurity was associated with poor mental health indices in every region of the world. We know, or we think that food insecurity affects mental health in several different ways. Firstly, just the lack of sufficient food intake on cognitive functioning, the social impact of not being able to share and prepare food in culturally acceptable ways, or even just basic deprivation being inherently harmful. And this has definitely worsened in COVID-19. We did not find any quantitative studies specific to children in humanitarian contexts, but several qualitative studies show that a lack of access to food is a source of psychosocial distress for children, causing feelings of stress, anxiety, sadness, and shame. And this was the same for caregivers. Households who reported higher levels of parental stress and parental depression also reported higher levels of food insecurity. And this is really important for several reasons, but one is that increased stress, anxiety, and aggression worsens child caregiver relationships, and in several contexts triggers various other child protection risks, such as neglect, such as physical and emotional violence in the home, such as peer violence, and also children's exposure to intimate partner violence within the household, which then has a negative impact on children's long-term development and health. The second main finding, or the second main heading, and I think this is something that many of us are probably a lot more familiar with in our own work or we've witnessed ourselves, is that when children and families do not have enough food to eat or enough money to buy food, they then resort to extreme coping mechanisms, and many of these take the form of child protection risks. And in many cases, it's also girls and adolescent girls who are particularly affected. So we can look at, for example, child labor, which is one of the most commonly reported coping mechanisms. When girls work, we know that they're more frequently engaged in informal, small-scale livelihoods activities, and this affects their earning potential, their ability to access food outside the home, and their ability to meet their other needs. In the case of child marriage, it's been documented for families to initiate marriages of their daughters even ahead of expected shocks. Girls themselves sometimes perceive marriage as a way to escape their household's food insecurity. When it comes to children affected by armed forces and armed groups, in some contexts, families have been documented to encourage or push girls to become temporary wives of combatants in order to gain access to food, to money, and to other resources. And then finally, sexual exploitation, such as transactional sex, sex in exchange for access to food or money to buy food, is also one of the most frequently reported, and particularly affecting girls and adolescent girls as a coping mechanism. The third heading is that children's protection is also affected when children and families are expected and forced to spend additional time, additional resources, searching, producing, or preparing for food. So for example, that we know children are at greater risk of neglect when caregivers spend increased time away from home searching for food or livelihood opportunities. This neglect can also be explained just by the sheer exhaustion and fatigue due to insufficient food intake, as well as the mental health outcomes of caregivers. And here, children with disabilities, living with disabilities, are particularly at risk. Whether it's that children are increasingly engaged in agricultural work, in collecting food, water, or firewood, these all create additional risks for children. And in some contexts, these resource constraints and economic insecurity was perceived as the main root cause or the main driver of physical and sexual violence against adolescents. And then the final heading is that food security interventions or programs can themselves inadvertently expose children to protection risks. And we found a few examples of these. So whether it's that changes were being made to food security programs, or the ways in which caregivers are implicated in various programs, or how certain activities like distributions are organized, this can affect children's safety, their psychosocial well-being, their ability to access adequate supervision and care, as well as the work that children may have to do as a result. So very briefly, those are the 4 main findings or headings of the evidence review. We didn't aim for this to be an exhaustive look at all the documentation out there, but we were trying to pull together a comprehensive and a clear picture of the different linkages between child protection and food insecurity in humanitarian contexts. What's abundantly clear is that across all contexts, children and adolescents view and they report food security to be really essential to their well-being and part of their definition of living a good life. However, we know that when families are forced to prioritize short-term survival needs, they may then turn to long-term strategies that impair their children's ability to break out of this cycle of vulnerability. And we can see child marriage as just one example of how this cycle can occur. Now, one of the limitations or challenges in doing this review was the amount of information we could find that was specific to humanitarian and fragile contexts. And this stems in part from the fact that children are rarely consulted in food insecure contexts, or that their experiences are not often captured by either child protection or food security assessments or monitoring data. And this is just one opportunity in which child protection and food security actors can strengthen their collaboration. So both sectors can be coming together, as we see on the next slide, to significantly improve results for children's protection and well-being. What we found from the evidence review, as well as subsequent conversations with child protection and food security colleagues, is that there are several good practices happening, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from the case studies that our colleagues will present in the next part of this webinar, in this call. But overall, the collaboration between child protection and food security actors is still ad hoc, and there's still several barriers that actors are facing. So as part of this report, you can find a series of recommendations for both child protection and food security actors on how to strengthen the ways they work together. And we really encourage actors to look beyond child protection mainstreaming. So looking beyond the ways in which we can make food security programming safe for children, but also to strengthening integrated programming in which both sectors can come together so that we can better prevent and address children's protection issues stemming from food insecurity. We've been using the results and the findings and the recommendations from this report in joint workshops between the CPAOR and the FSL clusters in South Sudan and Nigeria, and shortly now upcoming with the Central African Republic, in order to build consensus on the linkages between child protection and food insecurity in context, and to find practical ways for both actors to increase their collaboration. So we really encourage everyone on the call to also take a look and to use this as an opportunity to begin discussions in the contexts you're working in as well. Thank you so much, everybody, for your time. Thank you for listening. And Elspeth, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Yang, and thank you for sharing the findings from this evidence review, which I believe has been published a couple of weeks ago. So we really encourage you all to have a look through and to share with your colleagues and partners. Also, we've just realized that this Zoom has a 100 participant capacity. Therefore, the event is being live streamed. So if you do have colleagues that are trying to access the event, it can be followed on our YouTube channel. And Joyce has kindly put the link in the chat box. Perhaps you could also put it in again to just to point so people can share with their colleagues as needed. Thank you so much. So thanks, Yang. The report really does show how inextricably linked food security and child protection is, both the food security context as well as the programs designed to address these. So thank you so much for sharing the findings from this review. And it's really encouraging to hear that although we have a long way to go, there are promising practices and opportunities to further systematize our collaboration. So moving to our next speaker, we are very lucky to have with us today here, Mary Najeri, World Vision International's Global Director of Hunger. Mary is going to present a report in which World Vision actually consulted children across different humanitarian contexts in Western Central Africa on the impact of food insecurity on their well-being and protection. So before Mary takes the floor, we're going to play a very short video where we will hear from Saldana in Somalia. So Kira, please can you play the video? Thank you.
ها باهي أنا دواتي كوجور أنتم دينو كون مسلم لي ولا نسيم ولا قابل نسيم عرن إرني أنا قال أو جرني إرني قال إنه لذا قلت ما كانوا بيرتلين إنغرتي بيرتنا وارا نوغلي فقم دي جاري أكجورني جاري والآن مير داي أو كان مسلم أو كده دلوا جتكا كدرة أنتم دينو كون مسلم ولا نسيم مير دتنا ولا نسيم الله بيلاننا أنا أنتم مدي راتا ما يسوبي أيضا والكلام يسوبي أنا أسكت جيف ذلك على عبدالله تدي أني جين شجع هذا إسبتال بقدر أني جين شجع أنا على بنا ده كده دي وكوب نشان الكاريا ون ده كده عم بيني أون إرفالك أو قاعدي أنا
Great, thanks for sharing that video. We can hand the floor over to Mary now, who will speak to the video and to the wider report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elspeth, and greetings to everyone. And thank you for taking time to listen to that video. Now that we have heard the story of Sultana, we've heard about her journey, horrific journey as she describes it. We have heard about her solution to hunger, sleeping so that she can forget that she's hungry. We've heard about her coping strategy, going to work for the host community so she can get some money to survive. And we have heard about her pain of losing her support system. We have heard about her articulation of her vulnerability and the mistreatment that she's gone through just because she's a girl. I'd like you to just take a minute, not a minute, just a moment to think of the one word you would tell Sultana if she was with us today. What is that you would tell her after she shares with you her story? Take a moment. Now we can move on to listen to other voices from Sultana's friends. And you will note that what they bring up really aligns very well with what we've just heard from Young, the study conducted by Plan International and also the Global CP on area of responsibility. As World Vision, we believe in the irreplaceable value of children's views to make the response effective for children first and foremost. And we conducted a survey in 6 Western Central African countries on food's impact of food insecurity on children. And we also had internal dialogues with children from 15 countries or crises as part of our internal processes and practices for remaining accountable to children. And this is what we are going to hear and to see in the next slide. So when you listen to the children in Niger, they talk about what the lack of food is pushing them into, to begging, to prostitution, into thefts. And the children in Central African Republic have witnessed the death of their own parents due to hunger, leaving them vulnerable to exploitation. And they talk about how they are pushed to stealing, into easy manipulation. We hear from Angola and children talking about how they have to knock the doors of their neighbors begging for food. We really can hear the message that was coming out of the study done by Plan International. We move on to the next slide. and hear more voices of how households are not producing enough food to feed their families. This is in Lesotho. And therefore, parents have migrated to look for employment, and this has increased child neglect. Children are left alone, exposing them to sexual violence. In Myanmar, the story is no different. There is this common feeling among children that their parents, their caregivers, are struggling to make ends meet. And we have children having to step in to support their households with activities and to be able to earn an income through child labor. These are voices that are really coming out even from the study, from these children speaking their hearts and saying how the situation is for them. When we move on to hear what they ask of us, you can see very clearly that for children, they do not see division in sectors, that this is for child protection, so we should ask for this, this is for food security. For them, child protection, food security, they go hand in hand. And this calls for integrated response and services. More specifically, they talk about the need for us as the actors in humanitarian response, in ensuring that they are safe to reach even the most remote areas so that the most vulnerable children could be reached. When they talk of this, they are referring to the remote corners in the countries where they are, the ones that have the least infrastructure. Sometimes we find it hard to get there, or the ones affected by insecurity. But they also speak about some crises, some contexts, some countries, such as Afghanistan, Haiti, Somalia, where we have populations right now experiencing catastrophic levels of food insecurity. They speak about the child protection committees that are within their communities. And they say that we can support these structures to better monitor the cases of abuse, to strengthen the channels of reporting. We know that these structures exist, but how well are they doing their work? How can we support them better to be more self-reliant, to be able to be motivated to do this work for the children? They talk about strengthening support for child protection services and efforts because they note that there is a lack of willingness from some governments to improve child protection. They talk about other issues that we help them prevent, like keep away from begging, from child labor, from child marriage. They tell us to support their parents to provide for their families, to address inadequate food and lack of sustainable school feeding programs. These are the asks. Very simple, not put in any kind of sector, just what they think may work for them. And to note here is that these messages are all of us decision makers in the context of humanitarian leadership. And they apply from country level, regional to global levels. And we note that it is paramount. It is of paramount importance for us to have integrated responses, integrated work, approaching both child protection and food security in an integrated manner that responds to all these issues that are affecting the children who are really the most affected by the current crisis and actually any crisis that ever comes up. So as I conclude my presentation, and from the voices of the children that you have heard, I would have one question for you. What do we need to do together so that we do not remain silent to the asks of these children, but respond to them in a way that ensures the centrality of child protection in the hunger crisis response? What do we need to do together so that we do not remain silent? That's a question I would like to leave with you. Thank you very much. Back to you, Elspeth.
Thank you so much, Mary, and also thanks to all of those children as well that participated in the report, and thanks for elevating their voices on this platform. So thank you very much. We now have a few minutes for our first Q&A segment before we dive into some more substantive case studies, which I'm really excited to share with you all. I think a couple of people have asked about the evidence review that Yang presented. So the link has been shared in the chat box, but we will also share all links to any of the reports or documents flagged during this session in a follow-up email after the event. And I think there was another question which was also answered. So if anyone wants to perhaps put a question in the chat box or raise their hand. If not, I can't see any hands up. Perhaps we can move to our next segment for the case studies. But if you think of any questions, please do just put them in the chat box as we go along. So the second part of this session, as I mentioned, is where we're really going to look into some case studies. As was found in the evidence review, there are some good practices of integration. They're still a bit ad hoc, but we would really like to share these good practices with our group here today as we think about how we better systematize our collaboration together. So we're going to be doing a bit of a tour across 2 continents, starting with the Child Protection Area of Responsibility in Somalia, moving to Plan International in Myanmar, and then finally the World Food Programme in Egypt. So I'd first like to welcome Lillian Kona, the Child Protection Area of Responsibility Coordinator in Somalia, who will be sharing with us some work they've been doing around child protection famine prevention strategy and its integrated approach. So over to you, Lillian. Lillian, you're on mute. Fantastic.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, perfectly.
Yes. I was saying thank you, and I was greeting everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, from wherever you have connected. For my presentation, it is going to zone in into what we are dealing with in Somalia. So I would request for the colleague that is moving the slides to move on. As you have heard from the previous speakers, the situation in Somalia is no exception from what has been vividly highlighted by the previous colleagus. Somalia is currently facing an unprecedented drought where we have seen 4 consecutive rain failures. And as such, we are seeing a huge drought-induced displacement. As we speak, over 900,000 people have been displaced, majority of whom children. In some locations, we are seeing that the population is facing a catastrophic food insecurity levels, categorized under IPC Phase 5, where, for lack of a better term, would be at the brink of famine. Humanitarian actors across the response are not necessarily only food security and livelihoods, wash, health, nutrition, working together to really step up the response, both at standalone or integrated nature. Before I go to the next slide, I would also like to underscore the protective environment for Somalia. You all know that Somalia is largely conflict crisis that has been here for decades. So and then also Somalia was also not spared from the COVID crisis. So we are having children's needs, children's risks to protection, exacerbated by this drought that is in addition to already existing aspects that populations deal with. In terms of impact, we are seeing impact across directly on children, also around child protection services and at household level. Most of what has been mentioned, for example, mass separation, sexual violence, child marriage, exploitative labor, psychosocial distress, and aspects around increased risk to recruitment and use of children by armed actors is what we are seeing. This is in addition to so many other risks and harm that we have documented. The drought has also not left us working adequately as required in terms of the impact on our services, where we are seeing existing child protection services extremely overstretched, where we have had a 6 or 8-fold target for unaccompanied and separated children. Our case management services needed to scale up, and this scaling up is also not matched with the need that is coming in. Increased action on integrated referrals, and here we have been able to work around how to deal with children around with the camp management colleagues, health, nutrition, and all these other colleagues that are working at the forefront. Safe interim care services, we've had to tweak around family-based support, where we are seeing there is negative foster care practices, some families taking on children, mainly with the interest of exploiting these children and not necessarily supporting them be in a safe environment. And that is also a backlash that we are dealing with. An increased need for specialized mental health and psychosocial support. At household level, there is intimate partner violence that we see that is increasing. There is also likely negative care practices around children, and overall the whole negative worsening negative protective environment that is affecting children overall. And that is also highlighted by the study that Young just shared around families being forced to adopt negative coping mechanisms that essentially affect the protective environment of children. In the next slide, we'll be now diving in what we have put together as a famine prevention strategy. This is a scale up from the drought response plan that the interagency community here has put in place. For famine prevention, we looking around 6 particular pillars, which include scaling case management services across all locations that are affected, mental health and psychosocial support, working around addressing monitoring and surveillance through camp coordination and camp management clusters, working with food security, livelihoods, nutrition, wash and education clusters to integrate actions that enhance safety and protection of children, strengthening capacity of frontline service providers and advocacy, and then also working around family-based alternative care. You can access the entire Somalia drought response and famine prevention plan on the link provided, and the details around child protection, the strategy that I have highlighted here is from page 39. So please, can we move to the next slide? Overall, this is just a pictorial to show that how we are prioritizing. We've been able to zone in on locations that are IPC to address immediate needs of population in IPC 5, 4, and 3, and these are the red prioritization districts on the side. So overall, 6.1 million are affected, and for child protection, we are targeting around 900,000 children, and we've been only able, with the resources we have, to reach about 58,000. In terms of service gaps, we are still lacking across most of the response, and we will talk about that as we continue. Next slide. I just wanted to now bring us to, I know we have been talking about linkaging, but just for us to appreciate that for food insecurity or food security, we also need to look into, those immediate linkages like nutrition and child protection. In terms of food insecurity impact overall, as we have mentioned before, short, medium to long term, this leads to severe and acute malnutrition, loss of life, increase in abuse, violence, and increase in risk of abuse, violence against children, including within homes, loss of livelihoods, and negative coping mechanisms, as I mentioned. But then, if you look on the flip side on why and what happens if we work together, we'll be able to collectively improve nutrition outcomes, save lives, improve child well-being and protection, prevent and reduce risks to abuse, violence, and looking into strengthening protective environments, enhanced livelihoods, and fostering positive coping. So there are a lot of pros on working jointly together in a holistic way. And for the next slide, I would like to share with you an example, a practical example that we have been working with our colleagues in nutrition linked to this food crisis in Somalia, and we call it the Integrated Child Protection Nutrition Strategy. For this, we've had to look around how the causes of malnutrition is linked to not only malnutrition, but then also child protection. And for this, it looks at the different layers in terms from the underlying causes, immediate causes, and future. I will not dwell so much on this, but it's based on this framework and the child protection minimum standards that we've been able to work together to see how best to integratedly address the needs of children that are affected by malnutrition. Next slide, please. And in this framework looks at common objectives. There are 4 main common objectives that we have agreed on. The first is to understand is for both actors, nutrition and child protection actors, to understand their roles in enhancing child protection and nutrition outcomes within the humanitarian response, and this is drawn from the global commitments that we all have and best practices here and there. Contribute to the right to life, survival, and development of children and their caregivers. The third common objective is to ensure adolescent child mothers are supported throughout pregnancy to enhance their psychosocial well-being, child caring practices, and their protection. And then finally, to ensure vulnerable children and those at risk have access to nutritional and protective services. And you can access the full framework that details actions through the link that we have provided. Next slide, please. So based on this framework, we have put together an operational rollout plan, and the rollout plan key actions on joint assessments, conducting joint assessments with nutrition and child protection. Looking at, we have also integrated aspects to do with the identification of children at risk and referrals, as well as positive parenting in the community health workers manuals of nutrition, as well as the infant and young child feeding counseling guides. And this is being used in the current famine response strategy for both nutrition and child protection. We've been able to train nutrition workers on child protection. However, in the medium to long term, because it's a 3-year plan, we are looking at enhancing training as well on enhancing knowledge and support coaching on GBV and child safeguarding across 900 nutritional treatment sites. Within these sites, we should be able to also deploy social workers across social workers, or to have trained nutrition, child protection focal points to support within these centers. We are training child protection workers on causes of malnutrition, identification and referral, and establishment of child protection desks within the nutrition sites. We've managed to co-locate some of the child-friendly spaces with safe breastfeeding corners or centers that can be able to enhance infant and young child feeding practices for younger parents. Finally, we disseminated child protection referral pathways across and worked on joint key messages. I think the next is our final slide, which is looking into what we are learning, and a few key messages for you is, first of all, a holistic response to impact of food crisis requires a rights-based approach that responds to needs of children and families to avert to address immediate, medium to long term. And we have heard a lot about what are these consequences from the previous speakers. And then also child protection and food security actors have an opportunity to strengthen existing collaboration in planning and rolling out. We could see we have already started a few ideas here in Somalia with the food security sector, especially on vulnerability assessment, analysis and risk identification. Learning from the collaboration between child protection and nutrition, there's a lot of opportunity to scale up and to work collaboratively. Thank you so much for listening. And over to you, the moderator.
Thank you so much, Lillian. Thank you for sharing that overview of what is a very complex situation in Somalia. And it's really interesting to see how clearly interlinked food security, nutrition, child protection are in the Somalia context, and some of the progress being made to address the needs. The integrated nutrition and child protection framework is really a fantastic example. And the recommendations you shared are really pertinent. So thank you for sharing. And we would like to make an urgent appeal to all of those on the call with us today to share these with your teams on the ground or your teams working on Somalia, to really sort of build upon the opportunities that exist to further integrate food security, child protection and nutrition, both in the immediate short term, but also with a longer term view. And in that regard, all of the slides will be shared with the participants after this call, and it will have links to the documents that have been shared by colleagues. So you'll have all this information. So now we're moving to Myanmar, where we are joined by Olonchimeg Dorjpurev, who's the Child Protection and Emergency Specialist from Plan International in Myanmar, who will present their experience integrating child protection and food security programming in Rakhine State. So over to you, Olonchimeg. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elspeth. Hello, everyone. I'd like to share about the experience of Plan International Myanmar of integrating child protection into a food security project in the Rakhine State. The Rakhine State of Myanmar is a highly complex context, given the ongoing conflict, displacement, political instability, exposure to natural disasters, and chronic poverty. Nearly half of the children live in poverty, and over 37% have stunted growth in their Rakhine state. Children face also significant protection risks, and some of these risks are driven by food insecurity. Children and community members who participated in plans assessments conducted in the Rakhine state identified a number of child protection risks as driven by poverty and food insecurity. These include similar risks as Yang mentioned: psychosocial distress in children and caregivers, physical and humiliating punishment, including denial of food, child labor, trafficking, and child marriage. In light of this context, in partnership with WFP, Plan Myanmar has been implementing food assistance programming since 2014 in Sitwe and Mimbia townships of the Rakhine state. The current project has been implemented since last January, and it distributes monthly unconditional cash assistance of 17,000 Myanmar kyat per person to all over 60,000 people across 6 IDP camps in Sitwe township. Over the last couple of years, next slide, please. Plan Myanmar has strengthened child protection considerations in the design, implementation, and monitoring evaluation of this project. Plan Myanmar's approach has 2 elements. One is safe delivery of cash, which focuses on reducing child protection risks associated with cash-based transfers. The project trains all food security staff, community volunteers, and other stakeholders like camp management committees on safeguarding prevention of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, child protection risks and referral pathways, and psychological first aid. The project ensures that feedback and complaint mechanisms are child-friendly and that children and communities are aware of how to access these mechanisms. We conduct specific safeguarding risk assessments related to cash distribution and consult with children and parents to identify possible risks and collect their input on how to improve the safety of distributions. The second element started this year in 2022. We expanded our child protection considerations to strengthen the project's outcomes on children and their protection based on the information collected. We consult with children and caregivers and develop and deliver contextualized child protection messages to cash beneficiaries and conduct positive parenting and self-care sessions for caregivers. Plan organizes adolescent life skills and SRHR sessions targeting the most vulnerable adolescent girls. Team also supports and mobilizes adolescent girls to deliver messages to their peers through a peer-to-peer approach. The project also has additional cash assistance funds to support child protection case management on top of cash distributed to all beneficiaries in order to respond to urgent protection risks caused by economic factors. In camps where Plan is not the lead child protection lead, the project works closely with other child protection actors to ensure timely referrals. Finally, we've been working to strengthen children's participation in assessments and monitoring. This all has been possible because we've been able to staff a dedicated child protection focal point and community volunteers to this project, working closely with the food security team to facilitate referrals, conduct capacity building. And can you please go back to the, yes, thank you. Capacity building and awareness raising and monitor child protection outcomes. Over the past 2 years, we've been able to gradually strengthen child protection considerations in this WFP project and design an integrated child protection and food security approach. Next slide, please. Thank you. And what we have begun to see is that life-saving cash assistance paired with inclusive, empowering, and gender-responsive child protection interventions help us children and families reduce negative coping strategies that are harmful to children. The current phase of the project is not over yet. However, project staff and associates are already reporting positive feedback from communities. We are currently rolling post-distribution monitoring tools to use with caregivers and children, and this is still ongoing activity. However, initial results from almost 100 caregivers show that 91% report decreased stress. Children report also improved protection and well-being. All children who participated in our monitoring exercises agreed that since receiving cash assistance, relationships between family members and with caregivers have improved, and parents use less physical punishment. 65% of children responded that they and their siblings get better food because of the cash their families receive. Through this integrated approach, we are able to leverage cash assistance as an instrument for long-term resilience building of children, families, and communities. Next slide, please. Thank you. Based on our experience, I'd like to share a few reflections. The first is that as half of food security program beneficiaries are children, integrated child protection and food security approaches may bring better outcomes for both food security and child protection than individual sectoral programming. Secondly, monitoring at individual child levels gives insights into different outcomes of food assistance, especially when combined with child protection interventions. Consultations with children and adolescents allow both food security and child protection actors to better understand and validate how food assistance is reaching the most vulnerable children and families. And lastly, child protection and food security integration requires support from various actors, including donors. Plan Myanmar has been able to introduce this approach due to the generous contribution of Plan Australia, Plan Canada, and Plan Germany, and by leveraging our existing child protection expertise. We encourage all actors to strengthen support for child protection and food security actors, particularly local and national organizations and food security actors without such child protection expertise to develop integrated approaches to meet the holistic needs of food insecure children and to promote their well-being. Thank you. Over to you, Elspeth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alonjibeg, and thank you for sharing, I think, what really is a programming journey that you and the team have been on in Rakhine State. I think it's really inspiring also to see the steps that you and the team have taken over the years and how integration has gradually strengthened. So it started with the integration of child-specific considerations within the food security programming, and now we have a fully fledged integrated child protection and food security approach, which then contributes to holistic needs of children. So thank you so much for sharing this. It's really inspiring. So now we're moving to our last case study of this section and moving to Egypt, where we are lucky to be joined by Doa Arafa, the Program Policy Officer and Head of Social Protection from the World Food Programme Country Office in Egypt, who will share their experience in tackling child labour in Egypt through an integrated approach. So the floor is yours, Doa. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. And I'm honored to be presenting here with you. First, let me give you a quick introduction about the situation of child protection in Egypt, with specific focus on child labor. If we can move the slide, please. Okay, so in Egypt, there are a lot of child protection issues, including the child labor, which is almost reaches 70%. And in Egypt, this is a big number because of the population in Egypt is more than 100 million inhabitants. It's a negative coping strategy, as we have listened to the other presentation without repeating what was said. People or families resort to that as a coping strategy to poverty and food insecurity. Although in Egypt there is a child protection law that prohibits the children's work under the age of 15. However, the law still contradicts itself by allowing the children to work in seasonal professions. And this, and especially in the informal sector, with all the risks that come along with that. Also in Egypt, we have limited preventive and responsive services, weak law enforcement, despite having a National Council for Childhood and Motherhood and the National Act to stop child labor. A lot of effort done by the Ministry of Labor and Social Protection to prevent this phenomenon. I would like also to note about other gender or social protection issues. In Egypt also we have 90% FGM rate. The rate is decreasing. We have also more than 6.5% of child marriage, and a shocking 93% of children who are exposed to violent family or domestic violence. Next, please. So in WFP Egypt, we have been adopting an integrated approach to child protection through the community schools. The community schools are by default established in the most remote areas to integrate children who have dropped out of education back into the education system. So through this package, we provide cash transfers to the families that are conditional on attendance. We provide capacity building to local stakeholders, school feeding. We provide mothers with livelihood support. We strengthen also the education experience at schools through digital learning and school upgrades. Next, please. So looking specifically at the cash transfers, WFP provides cash transfers to the families of the students on the condition that they attend 80% of the class, of the school days every month. So, and this is in line with the National Safety Net Takaful, which also provide conditional assistance to the families in case their children attend also school regularly. We currently are reaching around 50,000 families actually, and during the COVID we have stopped this conditionality, but it is back. And we saw that because of the cash transfers, there have been strong impact on the gender and protection issues for the children. Next, please. We focused on social and behavioral change on child protection through the school's environment being like a community center or a community hub to promote knowledge and learning. So we focus also on child protection issues like FGM, early marriage, child labor. We engage religious leaders, we engage local stakeholders, we use drama and online tools to address these issues. And they also include the regular migration. Next, please. Another also very impactful activity or interventions that we implement is the livelihood support for women, for mothers of the children. Women in Egypt have a very low economic participation, especially in rural areas. So we provide women with training on income generation, on business skills, marketing and digital marketing. And then we also provide them with access to microloans. so that they can start their own income generation projects. Again, we found through the assessments that the women's income have increased between 30 to 50%, and that this had direct impact on the well-being of the family, especially protection of children and their nutrition and education. Thank you. And next. I've had here included a couple of success stories from women. I will give you just a moment to maybe read a couple of the quotes from those women. Okay, next, please. And last but not least, that we are working on the child protection, on the national child protection system in Egypt at different levels. At the community level, we are training the child protection committees that are officially established and are within the government structure. These committees are totally voluntary, and they work together to identify cases of risk and report them or refer them to through a referral system, including a hotline, including reports to the police officers. So what we do is that we foster coordination between the local actors on ground, train the committees on what to do or how to act, what response measures that they can take if they found a child protection case. And we have listened to a lot of stories about girls have been saved from children working in like worst forms of child labor that have been saved, and so on. We also work at the national level with the Ministry of Labor to integrate the child labor indicators into their digital monitoring system and digital inspection to the different companies. Our partners are definitely the ILO as well as UNICEF on the national level, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Social Solidarity, the National Council for Childhood and Motherhood. And that's all from my side. If you have any questions, thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing the great work that the World Food Programme are doing in Egypt. It's really interesting to see how the different pillars of the intervention are so intentionally designed to counter the main risk factors that contribute to child labour, but also at the same time really build upon the protective factors that already exist, for example, the strong child protection policy environment. So thank you for sharing this. We now have time for a short Q&A. I can see one question in the chat box already, and I can see someone has their hand up. So perhaps I'll ask Abba Tijani if you would like to ask your question. And if you could start your question by saying which speaker you would like to direct it to, please.
Yes, basically my question is to Doa, if I get your name correctly, right? So I was trying to get in terms of related to monitoring and evaluation or impact the work with regard to CP as well as the food security. What form of accountability can we put in place to ensure that we capture, to avoid one data duplication, as well as the impact of CP as well as that of the food security? Because I understand that the food security has its own indicator, as well as the child protection too have the indicator. So how can we align both, or what form of accountability tools can we put in place to ensure that they are both separated in terms of impact or beneficiary recording? Over to you.
Okay, so So always M&E indicators are always a conundrum in WFP because we focus more on food security. However, we focus on our monitoring more on this aspect and on the livelihoods assessments more on the qualitative assessments. However, in the new WFP M&E indicators, we have a lot of indicators to measure income, to measure food security that we are going to also adapt in the coming period. In terms of accountability to the affected population, if I understood correctly, in WFP we have a hotline. We have also feedback mechanisms through our field monitors. And at the national level, there is a hotline for children, for child protection. As I said, there are specific pathways for referral that are also part of the training package that we provide to the local communities. I hope I understood the question correctly. And you've also asked, or maybe somebody else asked about the child protection for refugee children. We don't have a direct intervention on child protection. However, we work on the livelihoods support for the families with the hope that this indirectly will improve child protection conditions for the children.
Thank you so much, Dora. I can see that Kim Leah, you have your hand up. Was this also the same question that you mentioned in the?
Yes, I just need to clarify it. Thank you, Dora. This is a good presentation. My name is Kim Leah. I'm the CPOR coordinator for Palestine. Here, I'm talking about the refugees. I don't know how to call them, but again, we have children from other nationalities, let's say Ethiopians, Sudanese, and South Sudanese, who are displaced by conflict to Egypt. Egypt become a gateway where they have to pass through it, and then they go to Libya and all of that. But most of those children, I'm not talking about the families, I'm also talking about the unaccompanied minors who are actually living currently in Egypt. And most of them are working as domestic workers in many families in Egypt. And considering that, looking at your strategy, this is really very important. It seems you are doing a great work. And I think what you presented is mostly on the Egyptians, not targeting those nationalities. So what specific activities are you actually doing about it? Because there are also some protection elements that are actually emerging out of that. Because if you look at, you know, we have these, I don't know whether these are true or not, like organ, you know, children are kidnapped and then the organs are taken out or something like that. And these are children who does not have any caregivers. They are just within Egypt and they just went there because of looking for a new venture. I don't know what strategy is there for WFP and others to employ on these kids. Thank you.
Okay, that's a big question. I'm not sure I can address most of the sections in your questions. However, I think WFP is not directly engaged on child protection from the perspective that you have explained or highlighted. As I said, we work on the protection of the family as a whole for the family's food security and livelihoods through general cash transfers or vouchers and the livelihood support. But I can definitely look into that with my colleagues and see if there is at least any coordination that's taking place with the humanitarian clusters or the UNHCR, or if there is any work being done, and then I can share back.
Thank you so much, Dora, and thank you as well for that follow-up. So I can see we have Monica and then Andrea. So maybe Monica, please, can you go first?
Can you hear me? Hi, everyone. Yes, I mean, the last question was really interesting. I can't remember the person who asked the question, but just to say that UNHCR has a joint strategy with WFP, setting out a framework for collaborative initiatives to enhance food security and self-reliance. Now, this is also one that we have to look at how it's actually looking at specific child protection components. Just to say that we have as UNHCR, sorry, I didn't introduce myself, which is really bad. I'm Monica Martinez and I work for the Child Protection Alliance, the CPMS working group, as well as UNHCR. And I just wanted to say that from the UNHCR perspective, obviously looking at the child protection angle, we know that food insecurity increases the likelihood of child protection risk. I mean, I'm not gonna repeat what has been already presented in this wonderful, wonderful presentation, but just to say that we have run a little bit of an qualitative analysis through some of the reports coming from the field operations. And we have found bits and pockets of coordination that are already happening with between food security and child protection. And one of them referring to the comment by the person before around the identification of children at risk or already suffering abuse, including separated and unaccompanied children. So again, this is something that maybe we can have later a bilateral conversation on how these children have been identified and their families being supported with cash assistance and the possibility of like buying food items. Also, UNHCR collaborates with the government, generally with protection services, to then provide food items to children that had been placed on alternative care arrangements. And this could be very well be those children that they were referring to, children that they need temporary care arrangements because they are on the move, as well as women through supporting women and girls, again, through placement in safe houses and provision of food baskets. So these are all areas where UNHCR is already working. However, we recognize that we don't have yet a systematized structure way of integrating the work across the two sectors, food security and child protection. So, you know, this is obviously an area for us to further continue to improve and strengthen and learn from these fantastic initiatives. And what we're doing now is we're drafting the child protection policy, which will become up shortly, that has a very this mainstreaming child protection across all the sectors, including food security. So things like identifying common areas of concern between food security and child protection through consultation with communities, adapting existing tools, including joint criteria, monitoring tools, training on each other, so training food security and child protection staff on both CP and food security concerns principles and approaches so that we can each of us correctly refer cases to each other, and of course include child protection and child-friendly messages in food security interventions. So that's a little bit what we're planning to do in the coming future, but I'm happy to take forward conversations also with colleagues from WFP and others in terms of how specifically we can focus on separated and unaccompanied children, because it's a very both delicate and interesting population. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica. Thank you so much also for sharing what UNHCR is doing and for also bringing a bit of a spotlight on refugee settings as well. I think there's definitely a lot of scope to strengthen sort of our cross learnings and collaboration and harmonized approaches. So thank you so much for sharing, and I'm sure there are some clear follow-up actions there too. I think someone had their hand up and put it down, but there's probably time for one last quick question. And I can see one in the chat box from Muthu Karupas about asking how children with disabilities are considered while designing the programs. So I don't know if any of the three presenters, Lillian, Alonchipeg, or Doa would like to quickly to respond to this one.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, a lot of actually the referral and the cases that have been reported by the child protection committees are related to children with disabilities, and this is part of the referral or the protection that is reported or action taken through the committees and the hotline as well. As for the rest of the interventions that WFP provides, especially for the women livelihood support, one of the selection criteria for the women to be provided with the support and the microloans which are a lot of criteria there, is the presence of a person or a child with disability within the family. So it's one of the vulnerability criteria that we consider for the selection of women to be supported by WFP. Finally, as well on the schools, we conduct SBCC campaigns, including inclusion, including how to handle a child with disability for the parents and for the teachers, and this is done through campaigns or the education material by the Ministry of Social Solidarity, by experts or consultants that are deployed by the Ministry of Social Solidarity. For example, last year we have reached around 150,000 people through a campaign on inclusion specifically. Finally, it's something that we are planning to do is to identify the community schools that have cases of children with disability and to see if there are any physical upgrades that we need to do at those schools to, like make them inclusive for the children. But this is something that we plan, have not yet started. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joa. That's a really comprehensive answer. I think we're running a little over time, so we're going to have to cut the Q&A short, but I can see there's a lot of interest and potential scope for lots of discussion. We do have a child protection in humanitarian action community of practice online. And we would really support engagement from broader actors across food security and child protection with these discussions, with these questions, and it would be a great place for us to kind of continue this conversation so we can provide in our follow-up communication more detail about how to utilize this online platform and the sort of learning community. So thank you so much for the questions and for the interest. So for the final segment of our session, Joyce Mutisu, the Deputy Coordinator of the Global Child Protection Area of Responsibility, will share some key recommendations for joint action. So these have actually been developed jointly by the Alliance, the Global Child Protection Area of Responsibility, Plan International, and the Global Food Security Cluster. They build upon the evidence base that Yang and Mary have shared, as well as learnings from the integrated programming and coordination, such as those practices and experience shared with us today by Lillian, Alonchimeg, and Joa. So over to you, Joyce.
Thank you so much, Elspeth. Colleagues, as it has been mentioned, this document has been developed to enable us think about working together and greater collaboration for addressing protection risks for children within food insecure contexts. The recommendations are divided into three: recommendations for child protection and food security actors, recommendations for humanitarian coordinators and humanitarian country teams, as well as recommendations for donors. We recognize that collaboration across sectors and clusters requires investment not only in financial resources, but also commitment from organizations and individuals that champion collaboration. The success of such collaboration will happen over time, and so it is important for us to invest over the medium and long term. We also recognize that there are opportunities for gains in the short term and strongly encourage humanitarian actors and donors to invest in such opportunities. These recommendations will be shared after the call today, and we will just speak to a few of them now. Recognizing that the goal to ensure children's well-being and development and to realize their rights is one that we all share, we call upon child protection and food security actors to work together in food insecure contexts to prevent, mitigate, and respond to children's protection issues resulting from food insecurity. This includes planning and conducting joint assessment as much as possible and to reflect the specific needs and risks faced by children in food insecure contexts. Child protection and food security actors should strive to work together to develop and implement program models and approaches which target vulnerable children and families, and to ensure that such programs monitor and evaluate joint outcomes, including positive benefits to children's well-being and cost effectiveness. We call upon humanitarian coordinators and humanitarian country teams to acknowledge the life-saving nature of child protection interventions in humanitarian action and to prioritize child protection in preparedness and response planning in food insecure contexts. This includes decision-making on resource allocation for child protection interventions, as well as intersectoral needs assessment, analysis, and response. To donors, when food insecurity and famine-like conditions are predicted, we call upon you to ensure that funding for specialized child protection interventions are prioritized alongside food security interventions and nutrition interventions. This includes funding multi-year integrated child protection and food security programs to address the multisectoral needs of children and families, as well as supporting the mainstreaming of protection, including child protection, in line with the centrality of protection in humanitarian action. We also call upon you to promote regular information sharing and functional cross-sectoral referral pathways, including at subnational level, in order that each sector may leverage from each other's information and resources. Finally, to all of us, humanitarian actors and leaders, as well as donors, we must remain accountable to children, ensuring that services and information are child-friendly and accessible to children in all their diversity, and that we work together for joint outcomes to realize children's rights in humanitarian action. Thank you for your attention, and we hope that we will all work together towards better outcomes for children. Over to you, Elspeth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joyce, for sharing these recommendations and really this inspiring call to action. As mentioned, we will share the recommendations document in English, but also in French, Spanish, and Arabic. So we really encourage you to share this widely with your teams, your partners, and your funders. So now to close this action-packed session, and thanks for those who are staying until the end, we would like to hand the floor to Marie-Hélène Kaiprianau, who's the Global Food Security Cluster Coordinator. Over to you, Marie-Hélène.
Thank you, Elspeth. Good afternoon, colleagues. On behalf of myself and Abdel Majid, the Food Security Cluster Global Coordinator for FAO, it was a pleasure to be with all of you today and discuss collectively how we can closely collaborate between child protection and food security. Thank you for your insightful contribution and your vision. As one of the participants wrote in the chat, hunger crises have the face of children. Food insecurity and hunger are increasing globally, and millions of people are at risk of starvation as a result of what we call the 4 Cs, the conflicts, climate change, the socioeconomic impacts of COVID-19 pandemic, and the increasing fuel, food, and fertilizers costs. Communities are thus exposed to severe food insecurity, stretching their remaining ability to cope. Food insecurity is critically connected to protection, and in particular to child protection. Food insecurity drives families to make hard decisions in order to survive. Some of those are directly affecting children, such as early marriage, child labor, school withdrawal, are some of the practices often utilized to cope with food scarcity in the household, or to access additional resources to buy food. Many of these choices have long-lasting consequences and can be reversible for children. Thereby, close collaboration between food security and child protection actors is critical. It can provide strong evidence-based analysis, allowing both response and mitigation measures, as well as integrating child-sensitive programming, collectively identifying best practices, as well as helping partners to learn from each other. The Global Food Security Cluster and members of its protection task force are working in close collaboration with the Child Protection Area of Responsibility and Plan International to support food security and child protection actors in the field to better understand, plan, and respond to the needs of affected children and communities. Investing in transformative and concrete solutions is necessary to create a more sustainable, prosperous, and equitable world. This doesn't just mean working together to address symptoms of the challenge. It requires thinking together collectively to reimagine how our systems can deliver on our promises to these and future generations. As a close, I would like to mention that to reiterate that the Global Food Security Cluster remains committed to turn the many declarations of the centrality of protection into practice. And the joint work highlighted here is one of the best examples of how humanitarian actors and sectors can work together to reduce risk for people affected by crisis, especially the most vulnerable children. We look forward to working jointly together. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these encouraging and inspiring words, Marie-Hélène, and for the Global Food Security Cluster's support to this session and commitment to our partnership and collaboration. We really look forward to continued collaboration, and we hope we have inspired all participants on this call to join us on this journey together. So with that, we will end the session. Thank you ever so much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the
Thank
session.
you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.